So, good morning or afternoon, whenever it is that you're watching this. Um, I feel bad for the change of the semester, and some days we're in Zoom, some days we're not. But it really seems like that this is probably the best format now. Pre-recording. We're going to try to be face to face on Wednesday, and then give you an assignment out of class on Friday, and get back together on next Monday. But break it up a little bit. But if you all decide that you really just want to do something pre-recorded rather than doing live at 9 o'clock on a morning, we can do that for Wednesday also. But what we're going to do today is quickly give you a run through of making wise decisions, thinking about a meaningful life as you carve out, create, or hear your own sense of call, as we've been looking over the course of our materials for what it means to find your way. Um, so we have a PowerPoint that we'll pull up and a couple short, very short videos. So let me see if I can screen share this with you here. And as we look at our PowerPoint here, the question that we're asking today is, how do I create my own path? And moving forward as we live out the questions. And as we think about that, I actually want to stop, and I should have pulled this up for you. Um, I want us to look at real quick. Um, I want us to look at the project, the final project that we have to do for class. And at the beginning of the year, or the beginning of the semester, I had talked about how we were going to read a book, and an individualized book, and I even sent you some ideas. I interviewed you, we talked about it, but that didn't really come together. I think it was a good idea for a 16-week class, but an 8-week class that's moving so quickly, it's just not going to work for us. So what we've done is kind of scrap that idea. We were going to journal, and I bought you journals, but that didn't seem to be connecting with people. No one seemed to be really doing that. And rather than at the end rushing through and having you all over 2 or 3 days kind of coming up with all those journal entries, that seemed to be really exhausting to you and not actually what journaling is intended to do. So again, scrap that. But what we're doing instead is something radically different, but I believe is a way for you to showcase yourself to future employers, showcase yourself to anyone that you are trying to create your brand for. And as you discover your way. Now, under module 8, we are in module 7, but under module 8, what you're going to see is something called the life design site. So pull that up, and what you're going to see is the project that will become your quote unquote final. This week, you'll be doing a lot of little things that are going to go into that final project. And actually, all throughout the semester, you've been working on things that will now go into this final project. So, what is this final project? I gave you a video that completely outlines it for you, but I want to show you what it really is. It's made up of the major questions we've been dealing with us in the class. For example, who am I? And under that, it's our mission statement, our Enneagram type, our Myers-Briggs type, links to our social media, and also a link to our favorite song, the song that is our go-to that kind of describes our life or who we are. So the question is, who am I? Secondly, whose am I? And this is really the backstory of our lives. Also, talking about our mentors, role models, and also our images for God. You did a project earlier for me where you pulled out 5 images for God and explained why. Then we're going to talk about dreams. What dreams are living with inside of you? And again, you did this previously. You talked about your dreams, and you also talked about a dream job. Then we go outward, right? Who am I called to serve? what injustices cry out to me. And that's why, well, that's where we're going to look at who we seek to help and serve the world, particularly what injustice really calls out to us. And then we'll also begin to talk about our own moral bucket list, our moral virtues. And then we look toward the end of the project by asking, what is my work and why is it important? That's where we're going to look at a resume, and or we're going to create a resume, and you'll create a LinkedIn profile. That's a social media site. LinkedIn, you'll create a profile there. And then what is my path or way forward? And this is where you're going to create your personal manifesto. Now, all of this stuff, these individual moving pieces, are all going to come into this life design project. So let me pull up what this is going to look like. And as we look at our life design project, we have one for our class, right? Finding your way. This is the final site or final project for the members of our course. And you're going to see the description of our course here, some great pictures from our day of service, the stuff that we used for class all semester long, our goals, learning objectives. And but the but that doesn't that's all finished, right? You don't have to worry about any of that. What you have to worry about is coming over here. This is the most important click you'll make, right? Clicking on pages. When you click on pages, you're going to find your name. And when you find your name, let's pull up Jen's here. When we pull up a person's name, what we're going to find out is just it's going to say your name, and that's it. Everything else you have to begin to create, from the picture to the back in the background to which you can totally change, and I would encourage you to change it to something that really represents you, to the font of your name. And then you're going to go down here and you're going to begin to add all these other things on your site, right? Which will become really, really important. This stuff won't be on your page. There we go. I want to make sure that I'm telling you correctly here. Because your page should simply be your name and the background picture. Now, if you pull up my name, you'll see an example of the project, what it really should look like in the end. Take a second. So you'll notice I've personalized the picture in the background, put a quote that's really important to me, and then I start talking about my life, right? Key words that are emblematic of my life. This is where then I included my mission statement and who I am, even with a little video of myself. I talked about my personality type, my Myers-Briggs, and my Enneagram. Here are links to my social media, my life song right here. Then here's my backstory. My backstory is a little longer, of course, and yours will be a little longer also. And then I just give a little paragraph or a few lines about where I see God in the world. Now, this wasn't super detailed, but just a word to describe where I see God. Okay. Then we move into dreams, my dreams and a dream job. Here is the sense of calling, who I'm called to, and discusses my call. Then I start talking about the injustice that cries out to me the most, and my moral bucket list, which you'll see my values here. Okay. And the moral bucket list is a little bit longer. And then down here, you'll see where I have my LinkedIn profile. You can hyperlink to that. My resume has now been uploaded. And you'll notice the resume, because it's much longer, I inserted using Google Doc as opposed to just typing it out because it would have been way too long. So the Doc is a really good way to include your resume. And then, of course, at the end, personal manifesto. This is kind of the charge for my life, and this is your project, right? So if you have questions about that, we'll be available on Wednesday on Zoom, or any point you can just reach out to me. But that's our project there. But let's get back to our agenda at hand today when it's thinking about how we move forward with our own path. And I wanted to start with a story from the Bible. A prophet, when we think about prophets from the Bible, or people who are called by God to deliver God's word, God's message, we think of the most famous prophets. Most famous prophets would be people like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Jonah. Um, but Hosea is a prophet that we don't talk much about. He comes from the latter half of the Old Testament, and Hosea was a prophet in a time when God's people were giving themselves to all kinds of false gods. And Hosea feels in his heart God calling him to marry a particular woman, and her name is Gomer. That's right, her name was Gomer. Maybe a red flag, but her name was Gomer. And Hosea feels this deep conviction that he's supposed to marry this woman. But this woman is a temple prostitute, meaning that she is in one of these foreign gods, places of worship. And because so many of the ancient religions are tied to fertility, a lot of these temples would have paid prostitutes where, in the religious act of worship, there is a sexual act to heighten your fertility as a gift to the gods. And Gomer was a temple prostitute. Hosea feels called to marry her. Now, we can get into the whole shaming of prostitutes and all that kind of stuff. Um, but it's very possible that she really was not a prostitute in the temple by her own free will. Systems have presented themselves to kind of lock her in or force her into being a prostitute. Well, the story goes that Hosea marries her and has children with her, has 3 children where he symbolically names the kids names for movements or realities of God's people. Once you are not my child, but you will be my child again. But the story is a battle, really a heart battle. It's an inner battle of Hosea's love for Gomer, but yet she refuses to be faithful to him. She keeps going back to the lovers of old. At one point, Hosea has to go and literally rip her out of the arms of a different lover, and says that I will make you faithful to me. And this story is a wild story, unlike anything else we have in the Bible, but it's a story of this undeniable, deep love and drive to be faithful to his wife. And even though Gomer throughout is unfaithful at times, Hosea provides this radical faithfulness of love. Now, all of this, because he's a prophet, right? All of this is symbolic of God's love and relationship with God's people, even though they are not faithful, even though they keep going to the temples of all these other gods. God continues to woo and reach out and love these people, right? Now, in this, the reason why I bring this story up today, as we now start thinking about carving our own path, is for so long in our class, we have been thinking about our calling or finding our way as tied with a career or a job. You are going to work in the FBI, or you are going to be a teacher, or you're going to be a psychologist, or you're going to be a counselor, and or you're going to be a coach. but we have we have too narrowly defined what a call is, because a call is not, sometimes it is your job, but for most of us it's much broader than that. And for Hosea, his prophetic call really was tied into his family. Some of you, your call will be a call to family first, right? It's not really about what you do for your job, it's really about your family. You serve your family. So Hosea is a really good example of the call to family, the call to husbandry, the call to being a husband, being a father. So I offer this story as one that shows us a much broader call rather than just a job, but really called to be family person first. Now, one of the questions that we're going to ask today is this: how do I make decisions? How do you make decisions? And when I ask that is, I mean, we typically don't think about that. We don't think about, um, we don't really think about making decisions. We just do, right? And the question is, what kind of framework or foundations do you use when you are making decisions? Kind of a moral framework. Not only how do you know right and wrong, but really how do you process? How do you discern whether you should do this or do that? Whether you should go to this school or that school? What are your foundations for it? And really, when I ask that question, this really gets at the heart of how we shape our life, and what are we using to determine our life. So when I say that, I mean, what is your vision for success? For so many of us, we're driven by having a quote unquote good life. But then my question would be, what is your definition or vision of good? And what do you think it means to be successful? But also, another question would be, what do you need? What needs to happen in your life, or how do you need to form to make sure that you have a life that you're proud of, a life that you can look back on and say that you didn't have a regret about? Now, I think it's naive to believe that we will live our whole lives without regrets, because where we love, we make mistakes. Where we risk big, sometimes we fail big. But I mean, I don't mean just individual regrets, but I mean a life of regret. We don't want you to get to the place where you're dying and say, if I could start over, I would totally do something different, right? What do you need in your life? Who do you need to become so that it doesn't happen for you? And our life is a series of decisions that we make. And today we'll talk a little bit about how we shape and form and make decisions, right? I want to give you a couple frameworks for decision making. So, again, in the course, we have been talking about a particular Christian spiritual tradition, and that tradition is the Ignatian spiritual tradition. And they give us um, a path, a toolkit for making decisions. So, when we're making a decision, we have to ask ourselves first and foremost the idea, um, we can only be deciding about good and positive things. What I mean is, I can't be wrestling with, should I kill my neighbor, or should I deal drugs, or should I, beat up my girlfriend? Those aren't decisions to be wrestled with at all, because they're clearly out of bounds. So it's not a moment of discernment. We only discern between good things. So, number one, I have to ask, is this good and positive? Because if it's not even a qualifying experience for a decision. So it cannot be harming somebody, violating somebody, or taking another person's freedom away. Now, if you're a police officer, you are protecting society. I don't mean that. But if you are violating somebody else's free choice, then it's a violation of this first step. Also, it can't be something that violates God's command. Also, it cannot be something that violates the common good. If it's something that does away with the common good or goes against the common good, then again, it's not even worthy of decision. Also, if this is something that's going to lead me away from God. So again, coming back to Do I quit school and sell drugs? Right? If I'm wrestling with that, that clearly would lead me away from God. So it's not even a decision. But but I don't think there's anybody in our class who is really wrestling with that, right? Like, I don't think you're thinking about killing your neighbor or doing some kind of harm. We are oftentimes gut-wrenchingly between a couple different decisions, a couple different options that are truly good, right? Do I become a pharmacist? Do I become a teacher? Do I get married and have children? Like, all of those things are good and beautiful and right. There's nothing wrong with any of those. They don't violate any of the things we talked about. But then, how do you decide whether you're going to drive a truck for a living or you're going to become a doctor? Like, right? So this is the kind of decision making that I'm talking about. So the first one is that you have to identify the issue or the thing that you are trying to decide. And with that, you want to be as clear and specific as possible. So it's not like place of decision making. It's the example would be, do I take this job? Do I move jobs and take this one particular job that's offered to me in Washington State? So it's not even, do I leave my current job? That's too broad. It's, do I take this particular job in this particular area? Now, with that, some things we're going to do in this next step are, we're going to collect some information, actually all the information that we would need to make an informed decision. So, what's insurance like in Washington State, and how much would my car be, and what's it cost to move out there, and what's the cost of living, and could I possibly make friends? What does that do to my wife and children? What does that do to their schooling? Um, Also, with that, um, I need to list all of my options, right? All of the possible ramifications and actions that come up. Now, we're not yet doing pro and con. That's not yet, but we're simply listening or listing all the possible actions that could come from this. And then we'll make a list of pros and cons. Now, the first thing we have to do is, this a good thing, right? But now we have to make it specific. The third thing we're going to do is state clearly the proposal and make it positive. So the thing I'm deciding is, moving to Washington State for this new position. And once I have clearly, positively, succinctly, specifically stated what I'm trying to decide, I then go to God in prayer. And what I'm doing is, I'm asking for God's glory to be made known. Because in this model of decision making, we want first and foremost God's greatest glory, for God to get the fame and the praise, for God to be exalted and loved in this decision and this action. So because of that, excuse me, because of that, I have to be open to whatever it is to be God's will. In the Ignatian model, we call this holy indifference. Now, holy indifference sounds like a really, really bad thing, but it's not. I use indifference this way, meaning when I come into the decision process, right? When I come into the decision making discernment process, these steps, I don't have passion one way or the other. I go in and simply say, I am open, God, to however you decide. And however you decide, I will love that and honor that. But this allows you then to be the most honest and authentic possible, right? So, what I mean by that is this: when I'm making this choice and I'm beginning to ask God to make me open to whatever God would decide, whatever God would make clear, I'm believing that God will make it clear. I am also believing that God has a path or plan, but also in that, I'm praying that my heart would align with God's heart. In signs that my heart is aligned with God's heart is that this decision will lead for my greater good. This decision will ultimately, in the end, prove to be the path that will allow me to be my best self and my most authentic and whole self. So let's come back to that decision about whether I take a job in Washington State or not. As I'm praying and asking God to make my heart open to whatever God decides, if it's in this process of discernment, realizing that going to Washington State would put undue burden on my family, would separate me from my family, would also cause such anxiety and worry and despair in my life, um, that's probably not the place, right? God doesn't want to tear me up in this process. So, but I stay open, and as I'm open to God's will, I have to ask, is this really going to allow me to be my best self? Because if I'm out there in Washington State and I'm actually hating my life, even though I'm doing, it might be some kind of great thing. If I'm hating my life and I'm angry and I'm bitter and I'm distant from my family and I'm not seeing my children, is that really going to lead to God's great glory? Now, as I've made the decision whether this is good or bad, right? And I've stated it very, very clearly. I have put my heart out there in front of God, to be open, to be wholly indifferent to however God decides. The next thing I need to do is I need to go and collect wise counsel and insight. Now, what I mean by that is this is where I need to check it with whoever my closest support is. For me, that would be my wife and my children, my mother. That for you, that could be a parent or parents, maybe it's your grandparents, maybe it's your coach or advisor, whoever it is, whoever your support people are, you want to check this decision with them, right? Present this to them and get their opinion or advice. Consult with them. Weigh what you've learned already. Beat it around with them. Hash it out with them. Allow them to give their words of advice. Now, you want to make sure that they don't become the voice of God in your life, but you do want them to give you helpful insight as they help you, as they know you, and also hear about this decision. We should never make an important decision of our life without wise counsel, without the people who know us having a voice in this. Now, for some of you, the people who would naturally, supposedly, quote unquote, be the voices that should be helping you, such as a parent, may not actually be the people who are most helpful for you. And if that's the case, okay, like they don't, just because they're blood related to you doesn't mean that they have to be a part of this decision making process. If a coach is closer to you than a birth parent, so be it. That's fine. Go to the coach rather than your parent. Now, after you've done this, after you've prayed for a holy heart that is open to God and indifferent to whatever God decides, or indifferent to the different choices, but really wanting what God decides. You've talked to the wise, spiritual, wise, and important people of your life, and you've got their insight. Then you're going to list the reasons for or against your proposal, right? And I down here in the bottom right corner of the slide, you'll see what we did is, so do I stay with my current job? And I look at the advantages of that and the disadvantages of that staying, right? Advantages and disadvantages. But then I also look at the proposal, which is to move to Washington State and take this job. What are the advantages and what are the disadvantages? And when I do this process, I have to be really, really honest with this. As I further explore this advantage disadvantage model, um, I then have to be honest that just because I have, 5 things are advantages and 3 are disadvantages, it doesn't mean it's a slam dunk, because then I have to start valuing um, the reasons, right? What are the most important reasons and why? So if my life is all about, let's say I'm 20 years old and my life really is about trying to save and earn as much money as possible for a down payment for a house, maybe that's the kind of where I'm at in my life. then finances, whatever this job can make me, may be more important than being close to my friends from high school. Yet, at my life stage right now, where I'm at 40, raising four children, um, in raising children in a blended home, money is not the top priority, right? The top priority right now for my life is, making sure that my children are as close as possible to their mother, and that they can have as normal a life as possible in a blended environment, right? So moving to Washington, if their mother is going to stay here in Pikeville, has to be really highly considered, right? Um, so we have to ask about the reasonings. What is most important and why, and then we ask the question about values, right? Of these advantages and disadvantages, which ones are most closely aligned to my personal values? Also, then, um, what options of the advantages and disadvantages help me serve God the best? What allows me to be most authentic and open to God's spirit in my life? And then finally, I would ask about these advantages and disadvantages. Which one seems to be most consistent with the way that God has dealt with me in the past? You know, um, how did this opportunity come to me? If God has always spoken to me through other people and this opportunity has come through another person, that may have more weight than if to say this is something that like I sought out myself and I was working really hard towards it, because maybe that's not how God has operated with me in the past. So after I have um, prayed for God's openness. I have a very clear proposal. I've talked to all the wise mentors in my life. I've listed the reasons for, advantages and disadvantages for it. I've weighed those options. I've stacked up the reasons behind why, the values of what is important and not important. Then I want to be honest about, in this process so far, where's my energy been? What I've been most passionate about. If I were hashing out this decision or this discernment with a coach or my parent, and I found myself really, really fighting with a lot of energy for one aspect. If I found myself really fighting for why I should be moving to Washington State, in the end, when I examine this and I look at my own energy and my own passion, maybe that's already the decision being made, right? Where am I most alive? So listening to your leanings and listening to your passions, even as you hash out for or against, is really important. Next, after you've done these steps of discernment, you want to pray to God, asking God to give you a sense of peace. They call it a spirit of consolation, meaning, does my heart feel right? I don't want to be uneasy about this. Grant me, God, peace in this decision. So when I make it and say, yes, I am deciding to move to Washington State. Now, granted, I may be nervous about all the, thousands of miles of moving and changing homes and friends and things that I know, but do I, in the end, really have a peace? Does it resonate in my heart? Do I feel a sense of relief now that I've made this decision? Or if I make this decision and I just feel nothing but impending dread, am I discerning something? And then ultimately, after I've made my decision, okay, so I've done all these steps and I decide, yes, God's path for me is to move to Washington State and take that job. I dedicate this decision in this path to God, and I say, you know what, God, I dedicate this to you. And even if this is ultimately in the end wrong, I want you to work good in your glory in this. Because what we find out is that sometimes we do miss what God has for us. And when we do that, that's never wasted. I think this is really, really important to realize that even when we kind of misunderstand the path for us and end up, being a pharmacist for 10 years when really God was calling us to be the janitor, none of that time is wasted. God uses all of those things to help us in our lives do what we're supposed to be doing or doing what we're called to do. If you feel somehow that God's calling you to be single when really God's calling you to be a family, it's no surprise that at 50 years old, even though you may have all these years kind of quote unquote missed what God had for you, that at 50 then you marry somebody surprisingly who's got like 6 kids, right? And you have children and grandchildren then, right? So God will use your genuine attempts at following God. God will honor that and God will bless it, and God will not allow you to waste anything because all will be used by God. Now, these are steps in discernment. Just want to cover them one more time. We want to make sure that we're only deciding about good things, nothing that's harmful. We want to make sure we're clearly, in a succinct way, um, putting out our proposal, our decision. We pray then for God's openness in our own lives, that we really want God's great glory, that whatever is decided, we will be happy and joyful with it because it's for God's great glory. We then, after we've collected a bunch of information, we go to our wise counselors and ask their insight, hash it out with them. We then make our own list of advantages and disadvantages, whether to go or to stay. We then take that list and examine what are our priorities and why. What is most valuable about this? What makes me and allows me to be the best servant of God possible? I then reflect on my own energy in making these lists, my own passions or leanings as I've been walking through the process. Where do I feel most alive? Where do I feel, scared and in despair? I then make a decision. And when I make that decision, I ask God for the peace, and then I ultimately dedicate this decision to God. So this is a framework, an Ignatian model of framework that people have been using for hundreds of years. It comes from a guy by the name of Jim Manny. He wrote an article called An Ignatian Framework for Making Decisions, 11 Steps for Making Decisions using this model. I, of course, adapted it to 9 steps. So let's watch this video about decision making 101.
Avocados are great. It's just something I noticed. Okay, we're serious. What are we talking about? Shoot. Got it. Hi, my name is Father Mike Schmitz, and this is Ascension Presents. So, when it comes to decision making, I think it's important to realize that as Catholic Christians, we're not alone. Like, you don't have to try to figure out how do you make decisions on your own, because there have been a lot of really, really wise people who have come before you that have a lot of really great wise wisdom to help you to make wise decisions. Number one, you can ask the question. Okay, what would the best version of me do? Right? So, like, what would the most faithful version of me do in this moment? Like, another way to ask it is, what's the freest version? What would the freest version of me do in this moment? You're faced with a decision, faced with a dilemma, and a lot of times we can say, like, but I don't know if I can. Like, but if you were free, what would you choose? Another way to say it is, if I was Christ living today as I am, in me, as me, what would I choose? It's kind of the classic, what would Jesus do? But I just used more letters to explain it. Because chances are, you are freer than you think. Those are some hopefully clarifying questions. But if you still don't know, of course, we continue to ask the Holy Spirit to guide us and to help us. But a great process for discernment is this. First is, we have to gather data, right? A lot of times people try to make decisions or try to discern stuff with only a limited amount of data. And I always have this image of, do you remember solving for X? I think that was algebra or geometry or something like this. One of those math things where you're solving for X. Oh, let's do Sudoku, right? So you have like, here's all these empty squares, and you only have some letters, and you're like, I can't go anywhere unless I get more letters. And so sometimes that's the case, right? So sometimes like I don't know where to go because with the information I have about this dilemma, about this problem, about this decision, I would just be guessing. So the first thing would be information gathering. So I'm looking at a religious community. Well, which one is it? Do they have a website? Can you go visit? I'm trying to figure out if I should quit my job and find another job. Okay, well, are there any other jobs out there? Like, what's the chances of someone with your education level and experience background, like getting another job? It's just gathering data. And that data is not the answer. The data might help you get closer to the answer. So information gathering. It could also mean not just gathering data, but seeking what they call seeking counsel. I'm talking to a living, breathing human being who's had experience and hopefully has wisdom that can give me some counsel. In my experience, this is what's happened. You can actually kind of engage with them in a really good and hopefully helpful way. When someone's looking for advice, a lot of times, like they're asking me for advice, they're asking me, Father Mike, what should I do? And they're giving me the responsibility for making the decision for them. When someone's seeking counsel, it's share your wisdom with me so I can make a decision and take personal responsibility for that decision. But at some point, what I need to do is I need to act. At some point, I need to move. And this might be you in this case. Now, does it mean, okay, I need to just jump off my old job and start this new job? Not necessarily. Does it mean I just need to say, well, you know, forget it, I'm dropping out of school and going to the convent? Not necessarily. But it does mean making some kind of movement and taking some kind of action. That action doesn't have to be huge if you still don't know exactly. It can just be a small action where you test out the information, you test out the counsel, and you just say, okay, would this work? The image I have, since I live in northern Minnesota, we have a lot of deer hunters around here, and so every year, around this time of year, people are sighting in their rifles. What you do when you sight in a rifle is before the hunting season starts, you go to a range, and you line up the target in the scope, you line it up as perfectly as you can, and you don't just line it up there and let it go and say, oh, I think we're sighted in. You line it up and then you actually have to pull the trigger. When you pull the trigger, you see how accurate the scope is to the target. Chances are it'll need to be adjusted. But that's okay. Why? Because you're doing this a couple weeks before the season has started. You don't sight in your gun when you actually have a deer in the crosshairs, right? That's the wrong time to do this. That's making a big, big decision without knowing actually will it pay off. So in this case, to be able to say, okay, I've got the information, I've sought counsel, I've prayed about this, and I've taken action, I've taken a step and just kind of tested it out. Because chances are, when you take that step, it's like, okay, that's a good step, but I need to adjust it. Or you could even say, okay, that was a bad step, that was the wrong thing, I can see now that that's not really where I want to be, that's not really where I want to go, but no problem, because I didn't just quit my job and like jump into the dark future. I didn't just kind of like say, you know, forget everything and go to whatever the next step is. I'm testing it out. Now that is simultaneously wise and courageous. It's wise and courageous because it's wise, I'm thought this out, I'm not being reckless, and it's courageous because it's one thing to line up the target and then walk away, another thing to line up the target and pull the trigger. It always takes courage to move. It takes wisdom to move well, but it takes courage to move at all. So if you find yourself facing a decision, facing some kind of dilemma, or in the middle of some kind of crossroads, okay, gather more information. Seek out counsel from people who know. People will write to me and ask counsel for like, you know, Father, where should I invest? I am not the guy to give you advice on investing. Father, should I pursue this degree in accounting or this degree in political poli-sci? Like, well, we can talk about it, but listen, I'm not the expert on that kind of thing. Seek out wise counsel, pray about it, process it, and then take a step. Pull the trigger and move a little bit. Then evaluate, calibrate, and do it again. For all of us here at Ascension Presents, my name is Father Mike Schmitz. God bless and be wise.
So you'll notice in that video, he gave us kind of a summary of what we've already been talking about, but also kind of a quicker, more helpful way of looking at the path here. And I want us to look at one other example. And this is a 1-minute video called the 10-10-10 principle for making, and this doesn't have to be like life-changing decisions, but really kind of any decision. So let's look at this video.
The next time you're unsure what to do, ask yourself, how will I feel about this decision in 10 minutes, in 10 months, and in 10 years? This 10-10-10 analysis comes from the writer Susie Welch and is one of the most appreciated tips when I give retreats about discernment. Let's say you're thinking of asking someone out. If she says no, you will probably feel bummed in 10 minutes, but in 10 months, you may not even remember her name. And in 10 years, you won't even remember that it happened. Or maybe she says yes, and in 10 years, you're happily married to her. Our short-term emotions are important, but they're not the full story. That decision we're anxious about may be minuscule when viewed from a different time perspective. When you're worried about a decision, think about how you'll feel in 10 minutes, 10 months, and 10 years. Viewed from those different angles, you might know exactly what you need to do.
Again, a quick way, very quick way of knowing how to make a decision. The 10-10-10 principle, right? 10 minutes, 10 months, 10 years. And with this, we find out a path of discernment. So today we've learned about wise decision making. We've also learned about the prophet Hosea, who was called to family. And finally, we're going to quickly look at, let's see. Nah, we'll talk about this later. I think this will cover what we need to do today. Have a great day.